Nobody in that parking lot knew they were about to witness the biggest mistake of one police officer's career. To them, it looked simple. A black man in handcuffs beside an expensive SUV. Another arrest, another afternoon. But in less than 2 minutes, the man everyone believed was a criminal would be called Sir by the highest-ranking police officer in the county. And every person holding up a phone would wish they had done something instead. If this story pulled you in, go ahead and subscribe so you never miss the next one. I've got another unforgettable story coming your way soon. Before we jump back in, leave a comment and let me know where you're watching from. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories travel and who's listening from around the world. Now, let's get back to the story. Fred Bryan felt the hood of his own SUV press cold against his cheek before he understood what was happening to him. 1 second he was reaching into the back seat for Ava's birthday bag, wrapped in gold paper because gold was her favorite color this year. And the next second, a hand had closed around his collar and shoved him forward. His glasses skidded across the hood and stopped near the wiper blade. He didn't reach for them. "Hands where I can see them," the officer said, though Fred's hands were already flat against the metal, already still. "Officer, this is my car," Fred said. His voice came out steady, which surprised him a little. Somewhere behind that steadiness, his heart was slamming against his ribs like it wanted out. "There's a registration in the glove box. My name's on it. Save it." The officer's name tag read D. Mercer. He was younger than Fred, by maybe 8 years, built like he spent his off days in a gym proving something. He grabbed Fred's wrist and wrenched it back, and metal clicked shut around it, then the other. Fred exhaled slowly through his nose. He thought about Ava standing outside her school in 20 minutes, scanning the pickup line for his truck, and something in his chest went tight, in a way that had nothing to do with the cuffs. Around them, the parking lot of Riverside Commons had gone still in that specific way crowds do right before they decide what kind of crowd they're going to be. A woman near the pretzel cart had her phone up before Fred even finished hitting the hood. A man in a golf shirt filmed from the doorway of the shoe store like he was recording a nature documentary. Somebody's kid asked what was happening and got hushed. Nobody moved to help. Nobody asked Mercer a single question. 30, maybe 40 people, and every one of them chose the phone over the 10 feet of space between where they stood and where Fred was bent over the hood of a car he'd spent 6 months of unpaid labor restoring. "Run the plate," Fred said again, quieter this time. "Before you decide who I am, please, just run it." Mercer laughed. Not a big laugh, just enough to let Fred know it had landed as a joke. "Yeah, that's what they all say." He turned toward the crowd like he was performing for them now, not just working. "Folks, we got a call about a stolen vehicle matching this description. Gentleman here says it's his. It is mine." Fred kept his eyes on the hood, on the small chip in the paint near the hinge that he'd been meaning to touch up. "Gerald Whitfield transferred title to me in March. Payment for a restoration. I can show you the paperwork. It's inside the vehicle." "I'm sure it is." Mercer didn't move toward the glove box. He didn't move toward anything except his radio, keying it to request a tow. "This'll get sorted downtown." An older man near the entrance to the hardware store, maybe 70, wearing a faded cap that said something about a ship, stepped half a step forward. "Officer, might be worth just checking the plate first. Take you 30 seconds. Mercer didn't even look at him. "Sir, I'm going to need you to stay back." The old man stayed back. Fred watched him do it, watched the moment pass, watched the man's jaw work like he wanted to say more, and didn't. Fred understood. He wasn't angry at any of them, not really, not yet. Fear did strange, small things to people, made them quiet when they most needed to be loud. The tow truck pulled into the lot 2 minutes later, its yellow lights turning lazy circles against the storefronts. Mercer walked toward it, already talking to the driver, already treating the matter as settled, already moving Fred toward the back of the patrol car with one hand hooked under his cuffed arm. That was when the sound changed. It started as engines, 3 of them, then the crunch of tires cutting hard across the lot's speed bumps. Not one patrol car, 3 county SUVs, black with gold shields on the doors, lights rolling but no sirens, arranged like they'd been sent for something bigger than a stolen vehicle report. The crowd's phones swung toward the new arrivals. Someone murmured that it was about to get worse. A woman near the front actually stepped back, pulling her son by the shoulder like she expected gunfire. The lead SUV stopped at an angle, blocking the tow truck's path entirely. The door opened. A man stepped out in a chief's uniform, silver-haired, 4 stars on each shoulder, moving with the particular unhurried certainty of someone used to rooms going silent when he entered them. He didn't look at Mercer. He didn't look at the crowd. His eyes found Fred immediately, the way a person's eyes find something they've been afraid of losing. He walked straight past his own officer. Mercer opened his mouth, some instinct telling him to explain himself, to assert whatever remained of his authority. Nothing came out. The chief didn't so much as glance at him. He stopped in front of Fred, close enough that Fred could see the man's hands were actually trembling, just slightly, at his sides. "Take those cuffs off him." His voice cracked once before he steadied it. He reached out and gripped Fred's shoulder, the one still pressed near the hood. "Sir," he said it again, softer. "I'm sorry we kept you waiting." The parking lot went silent enough to hear the tow truck's engine idling behind them, forgotten now, useless. Nobody understood why a county police chief was calling a handcuffed man "sir." Nobody understood why his hands were shaking. And Officer Daniel Mercer, still holding the radio he'd used to call for that tow truck, understood only one thing, with sudden, sickening clarity. He had made a mistake he could not take back. If you've ever been judged before anyone bothered to ask your name, don't scroll past this one. Hit subscribe now, because if you leave before you see what happens to Fred, you're doing exactly what that crowd did. Don't be part of the crowd. 3 hours before his face ever touched that hood, Fred Bryan was on his knees in the bay of his own garage, elbow deep in a fuel line that had no business fighting him this hard. "Come on," he muttered, wrist twisting the fitting a quarter turn at a time. "You're older than Ava, and you're still stubborn about everything." The garage smelled the way it always did. Cut oil, old rubber, the faint metallic sweetness of brake cleaner, and Fred had long since stopped noticing it as a smell at all. It was just the air where he worked. Bryan Restorations occupied a squat brick building 2 blocks off the highway access road, 4 bays, 1 office, with a space heater that only worked if you kicked it, and a reputation that traveled a lot farther than the building itself did. People who wanted a 40-year-old Bronco brought back to factory spec came to Fred. People who wanted an emergency response vehicle's rescue systems rebuilt from the frame-up, the kind of work where a mistake meant a trapped officer instead of a stalled engine, came to Fred too. He didn't advertise the second kind of work. It found him anyway. The fitting finally gave. Fred wiped his hands on a rag that was more grease than cloth at this point and glanced at the clock mounted crooked above his workbench. 2:40. Ava got out at 3:15. He allowed himself a small smile, the kind that came without him deciding to make it. Today she turned 10. 10 years old, and somehow every one of those years had passed both faster and slower than he expected, when Renee died, and it became just the two of them figuring out how a family kept being a family with a piece missing. He'd promised her something specific this year, not just a gift but a whole day. Pancakes for dinner, the movie she'd been begging to see, and the bracelet from the jewelry counter at Renfield's that she'd pointed at through the glass 3 weekends running without ever asking him to buy it. Ava didn't ask for things. She'd learned early, too early, that some things simply weren't there to ask for, and Fred hated that lesson more than almost anything else her mother's death had taught her. He finished the fuel line, closed the panel on the rescue vehicle parked in Bay 3, county property, on loan for its annual system overhaul, done 2 days ahead of schedule because Fred didn't believe in doing safety equipment late, and peeled off his coveralls. Underneath he wore a plain gray work shirt, clean, nothing fancy. He'd learned that about himself too, somewhere along the way. He didn't need people to look at him and see anything except a man who did good work. The county knew what he'd done for their fleet. The department knew what he'd done, once, on a stretch of Route 9 nobody liked to talk about. That was enough. He'd never needed the rest of the world to know his name. He locked the garage, patted the doorframe out of habit, and walked to the black SUV parked at the curb. It still didn't quite feel like his, 6 months after Gerald Whitfield had signed the title over. Gerald had wanted to pay Fred in cash for the restoration, a rare post-war touring model, the kind of car that made grown men weep quietly in showrooms. But the number kept sliding sideways in negotiations, weeks turning into months, an unpaid balance that finally embarrassed Gerald enough that he'd shown up one morning with the paperwork for the SUV instead. "Take it," Gerald had said. "It's worth more than what I owe you, and we both know it. Least I can do." Fred had tried to argue. Gerald hadn't let him. Now it sat at the curb, dark and polished, looking like it belonged to someone with a much different life than the one Fred actually lived. He climbed in, checked the clock again, and pulled out toward the shopping plaza. Ava's bracelet wasn't going to buy itself, and he wanted it wrapped before pickup. He didn't notice the man watching him from across the lot when he arrived. He had no reason to. Gordon Hale did. Gordon was sitting in his own car, engine off, waiting on a call from his broker that hadn't come yet, when the black SUV pulled into a space 3 rows over. He recognized it instantly. Recognized it the way a man recognizes an old wound reopening. 6 months ago, at a charity auction for the Children's Hospital, Gordon had wanted that car. Had wanted it badly enough to raise his paddle 4 times past what he'd told his wife he'd spend, and still lost it to a bid from a man in a windbreaker who didn't even look like he belonged in the room. Gordon had asked around afterward, quietly, who the man was. A mechanic, someone told him. Just a mechanic. Gordon had laughed at the time. Now, watching Fred climb out of that same SUV in a plain gray shirt, keys in hand, the laugh curdled into something else. There was no version of this that made sense to Gordon. A mechanic didn't drive a car like that. A mechanic didn't win it fair at auction and then somehow end up owning it besides. Something was wrong here, Gordon decided, and once he'd decided it, the decision felt like certainty. He pulled out his phone. 911, what's your emergency? Yeah, I want to report a stolen vehicle. I'm at Riverside Commons, and there's a man getting into a black SUV that I'm positive doesn't belong to him. I saw it at auction. I know who actually owns cars like that, and it isn't him. The dispatcher asked him to stay on the line. Gordon didn't stay long. He gave a description, gave the plate number he still remembered from the auction catalog, and hung up feeling something close to satisfaction settle into his chest. 4 minutes later, the call reached Officer Daniel Mercer's radio. He was 2 blocks away, running behind on a shift that had already given him a fender bender and a noise complaint, and he took the details the way he took most details that day, quickly, and without much room left over for doubt. By the time he turned into the Riverside Commons parking lot, Daniel Mercer had already decided exactly what kind of man he was about to find. Officer Daniel Mercer parked at an angle that blocked the black SUV's only easy exit, the way he'd been trained to for a possible stolen vehicle stop, and sat for a moment, running the plate through his mobile terminal before he got out. The screen took its time loading. He didn't wait for it. He'd worked enough of these calls to think he already knew the shape of this one. A nice car, a caller who sounded certain, a neighborhood where nice cars sometimes belonged to people and sometimes didn't. He'd tell himself later that he was being careful, being thorough, doing exactly what the job asked of him. In the moment, none of that felt like a decision. It just felt like knowing. He stepped out, hand resting near his belt, and walked toward the SUV, where a man in a plain gray work shirt was leaning into the back seat, pulling out a small gift bag wrapped in gold paper. "Sir, step away from the vehicle." Fred straightened, gift bag still in hand, and turned toward the voice with the unhurried calm of a man who had no reason yet to think anything was wrong. "Afternoon, officer. Something I can help with?" "Step away from the vehicle," Mercer said again, louder this time, closing the distance faster than the moment seemed to call for. "Hands where I can see them." Fred set the gift bag gently on the pavement, the kind of care a man takes with something he doesn't want to see damaged even in the middle of confusion, and raised his hands. "This is my vehicle," he said. "I've got registration in the glove box, and I can show you my license right now if that helps. I've got a report that this vehicle was stolen." Mercer's eyes moved over Fred quickly. The work shirt, the grease still faintly dark under 2 of his fingernails. The general unremarkable look of a man who'd spent his day under the hood of something else entirely. Matches the description exactly. "It's not stolen. I own it." Fred kept his voice level, the same tone he used talking down a nervous client whose car had come back from restoration, looking different than they'd pictured. There was a transfer of title back in March. Gerald Whitfield signed it over to me. If you check the county records, my name's on it. We'll sort that out. Turn around, hands on the vehicle. Fred didn't move immediately, and that half-second of hesitation was the wrong thing to do in front of a man already looking for confirmation of what he believed. Officer, I'm not resisting anything. I'm asking you to run the plate before this goes any further. It'll clear this up faster than either of us standing here. Turn around. Mercer's hand closed around Fred's arm and pulled, more force than the moment required, spinning him toward the hood. Now. Fred turned. There wasn't a version of the next 30 seconds where fighting it improved anything, and he knew that with the kind of clarity that came from having lived long enough to learn which battles were worth losing on purpose. His palms met the warm metal of the hood. Somewhere behind him, he heard the first phone come out, that small, distinct click of a camera app opening. I've got documentation for this vehicle in the glove box, Fred said, calm, steady, each word placed like a tool set down in exactly the right spot on a workbench. Ownership transfer, registration, insurance. It's all right there. Would take you 10 seconds to check. We'll get to that. Officer, please, just look. Mercer didn't look. He pulled Fred's wrist behind his back instead, and the first cuff closed with a sound that seemed, to Fred, far louder than it should have been. This is a mistake, Fred said, quieter now, not pleading, just stating it the way he'd state a fact about torque specs or fluid pressure. You're making a mistake. Save it for downtown. The second cuff clicked shut. By then, a crowd had gathered without Fred quite noticing it form, the way weather gathers, unremarkable until suddenly it's overhead. A woman near the pretzel cart holding her phone at arm's length. A man in a golf shirt filming from a doorway like the scene in front of him belonged to a show he was watching rather than a life happening 10 feet away. A mother pulling her son by the shoulder, murmuring something to hush his questions. Nobody stepped forward. Nobody asked Mercer a single thing. Fred felt the pavement's heat radiating up through his shoes, felt Ava's gift bag sitting somewhere behind him on the ground, felt the specific quiet humiliation of being spoken about in the third person by a man who hadn't asked him a single real question yet. Folks, Mercer said, raising his voice slightly for the benefit of the growing audience. We've got a report of a stolen vehicle matching this description. We're handling it. An older man near the hardware store entrance, gray-bearded, wearing a faded cap with a ship's silhouette stitched across the front, took a slow step forward. Officer, might be worth running that plate first. Save everybody some trouble. Mercer didn't turn his head. Sir, I need you to stay back. The old man stopped where he stood. Fred watched him do it out of the corner of his eye, watched the moment pass, the way water passes over a stone, and felt no anger toward him. Fear did what fear did. It made good people quiet at exactly the moment they most needed to be loud, and Fred understood that better than most. I'm asking you one more time, Fred said, his cheek nearly against the hood now, voice still even, still without a trace of the fear moving through his chest. Run the plate before you decide who I am. Mercer straightened, keyed his radio instead, and requested a tow. This'll get sorted at the station, he said, and there was something almost satisfied in the way he said it. A man confirming a story he'd already written for himself before he'd ever stepped out of his car. Fred closed his eyes for just a moment, thought of Ava standing at the pickup line in 20 minutes, gold wrapping paper crumpled somewhere on the pavement behind him, and said nothing else. The tow truck was already 3 minutes out. The gift bag stayed where Fred had set it down, gold paper catching the afternoon light every time a passing car's shadow slid off it, and somehow that small detail bothered Fred more than the cuffs did. He kept glancing at it sideways, unable to help himself, as if watching it might keep it safe. You want to tell me your name? Mercer asked, not because he needed it yet, but because filling out a report required the appearance of process, even when the outcome had already been decided. Fred Bryan. He said it clearly, the way he'd say it to anyone, no different than introducing himself to a new client. Bryan Restorations, 2 blocks off the highway access road. You can call the shop. Someone's there. We'll look into it. Fred doubted, in that moment, that anyone was going to look into anything before the tow truck arrived and made the question academic. A man in a paint-stained work shirt broke from the edge of the crowd, moving with the particular urgency of someone who recognized a face and couldn't stay quiet about it. "Hey, I know him," the man said, loud enough for Mercer to hear. "That's Fred Bryan. He redid the transmission on my truck last spring. Man does good work all over this county. Everybody knows him." Mercer glanced over, unmoved. "Appreciate that, sir, but this is a police matter." "I'm telling you, you've got the wrong idea here. Sir, step back or I'll ask you to leave the area." The man stopped, jaw working, and looked at Fred with an expression that carried more apology in it than the moment could hold. Fred gave him the smallest nod he could manage, cheek still against the hood, a wordless thank you for trying. The crowd had thickened now, the kind of gathering that fed on its own size, each new arrival drawn by the sight of everyone else already stopped and watching. Phones rose in a loose, uneven wall. Somewhere behind Fred, a woman was narrating quietly into her phone's microphone, describing the scene like a sports commentator, the tone reserved for something she'd already decided was entertainment, rather than a man's life bending sideways in real time. The elderly man in the ship's cap hadn't left. He stood near the hardware store entrance, arms crossed, watching with the stillness of someone who'd seen enough of the world to recognize when something in front of him was wrong, and was trying to decide how much of his own comfort he was willing to spend fixing it. He tried once more. "Officer, I served 22 years, and I've watched a lot of good men lose a badge over less than what you're doing right now. Just run the plate, please." Mercer's face tightened, the first real crack of irritation showing through the professional mask he'd been wearing. "I appreciate your service, sir, but I need you to stop interfering." "I'm not interfering. I'm asking you to do your job the right way. Last warning." The old man held his ground a moment longer, then, with visible reluctance, stepped back into the crowd. Fred watched the exchange sideways, grateful and heartbroken in the same breath, grateful that someone had tried, heartbroken that trying hadn't been enough. His mind kept sliding, unbidden, toward the school 3 miles away, toward Ava, standing at the edge of the pickup line, scanning every dark-colored SUV that turned the corner, waiting for the one that was his. She'd start to worry soon. She always worried a little too easily since Renee died, some fear buried under her ribs that people she loved simply stopped arriving sometimes, without warning, without an ending that made sense. He wanted, more than he wanted the cuffs off, for someone to call the school, to let them know he'd be late. Nobody was going to do that for him. Nobody here even knew to ask. "Sir," Fred's voice had dropped, low, meant only for Mercer now. "My daughter turns 10 today. She's expecting me in 15 minutes. Whatever this is, can we resolve it fast enough that I don't miss that?" Something flickered across Mercer's face, brief, almost human, and then it was gone, replaced by the same flat certainty he'd walked in with. Should have thought about that before. Fred closed his eyes for a moment. He didn't answer that. There wasn't an answer that would land the way he needed it to, not with a man who'd already decided what kind of person Fred was, before Fred had said a single word. The tow truck's engine became audible before the truck itself rounded the corner into the lot, a low mechanical growl that cut through the murmur of the crowd. Mercer straightened at the sound, visibly relieved to have something concrete to point to, some forward motion in a stop that had otherwise consisted of one man calmly repeating himself. "Vehicles getting impounded," Mercer announced to no one in particular, to everyone at once, the performance of authority aimed at the phones as much as at Fred. "We'll get this straightened out downtown. The registration's in the glove box," Fred said again, quieter now, more tired than insistent. A man who understood the words weren't going to change anything, but felt he owed it to himself to keep saying them anyway. "It would take you 30 seconds. Mercer didn't answer. He walked toward the tow truck instead, waving the driver in, gesturing at the SUV's front end, like a man directing traffic, rather than dismantling someone's afternoon. Fred stayed where he was, wrists aching faintly against the metal, watching the truck's flatbed lower with a mechanical whine, watching his own reflection bend and warp across the black hood of the car Gerald Whitfield had given him, in a moment of genuine gratitude 6 months ago. Somewhere behind him, the crowd's phones kept rolling, capturing a story none of them yet understood, waiting, like Fred was, for whatever came next. The tow truck's flatbed groaned as it began to lower, metal cable unspooling with a slow mechanical whine, and for a moment Fred let his mind go somewhere else entirely, somewhere the cuffs couldn't follow. 8 years ago, on a stretch of Route 9 that curved hard around the reservoir, Fred Bryan had been driving home from a late job when he came over the rise and found the world on fire. A tanker truck had jackknifed across both lanes, and a county patrol SUV, first on scene, had been clipped in the spin and shoved into the guardrail hard enough to buckle its frame. Fuel had already caught along the shoulder by the time Fred pulled over, flames low and spreading, the kind of fire that looked almost lazy right up until it wasn't. He remembered the sound most, not the fire, not even the tanker's hiss. The pounding, 2 officers trapped inside the SUV, its doors jammed from the impact, one of them shouting through a gap in the window that the locks wouldn't release, that the wiring must have shorted, that they were stuck. Fred hadn't thought about it as heroism. He'd thought about it as a mechanical problem with a clock attached. He'd popped his own trunk, grabbed the kit he kept for roadside jobs, and gone to work on a door he'd never seen before, under conditions no shop manual accounted for, prying the frame just enough to force the manual release before the fire reached where it needed to. 2 officers climbed out that day. One of them, younger, maybe 26 at the time, hadn't stopped shaking for a full 10 minutes afterward, sitting on the guardrail with soot on his face, staring at Fred like he was trying to memorize him. "What's your name?" the young officer had asked. "Fred Bryan. I'm not going to forget that." His name, Fred would learn weeks later from a county liaison who came by the shop to thank him formally, was Richard Collins. Fred hadn't wanted the attention that followed. He'd turned down 2 ceremonies, a plaque he still hadn't picked up from wherever it sat in some county storage closet, and an interview request from a local paper that would have put his face and his shop's address in front of more people than he was comfortable with. What he hadn't been able to turn down, because it came in the form of a contract rather than a spotlight, was the county's request that he take over maintenance and system design for their entire emergency response fleet. Rescue vehicle systems needed someone who understood both mechanics and the seconds that mattered when doors wouldn't open. Fred understood both better than anyone the county had on payroll. Over the following years, as Richard Collins rose through the ranks, first sergeant, then captain, then eventually chief, he never stopped calling on Fred personally for training sessions. Not press events, not photo opportunities, just Fred in front of small groups of officers and mechanics, walking them through rescue release systems, door mechanisms, hydraulic failures, the unglamorous specifics of getting people out of vehicles that fire, water, or impact had turned into traps. "You saved my life on a Tuesday afternoon and never told anyone," Collins had said to him once, years later, over coffee neither of them had touched. "Least I can do is make sure the next 20 officers who need it get trained by the man who actually knows how." Fred had let him have that. He'd never asked for public thanks, never wanted his name attached to the story beyond the small circle who already knew it. He did the work because the work mattered, not because of who might be watching him do it. The memory ended the way memories do, abruptly, pulled back into the present by the sound of tires cutting hard across a speed bump. Fred blinked, and the parking lot returned to him in full, harsh daylight. Mercer's hand still loosely at his shoulder, the tow truck's flatbed nearly level with the pavement now. 3 engines, not one, growing louder, and then visible. 3 black county SUVs sweeping into the lot with lights turning silently against the storefronts. The crowd's attention shifted instantly, phones swinging away from Fred and toward the new arrivals, a low murmur running through them that carried something close to dread. More officers. Whatever this had been, it was apparently about to become bigger. Mercer straightened beside Fred, some instinct in him rising toward attention, the posture of a man expecting backup, expecting confirmation, expecting his version of events to be reinforced rather than dismantled. Fred, cheek still resting near the hood, felt something shift in his own chest that he couldn't quite name yet, not hope exactly. He'd learned a long time ago not to spend hope carelessly, but something adjacent to it, some quiet recognition working its way up from a place he hadn't let himself access all afternoon. The lead SUV came to a stop at an angle, blocking the tow truck's path entirely, close enough that its front bumper nearly kissed the flatbed's edge. For a moment, nobody moved. The engine ticked as it cooled. The crowd held its collective breath, unsure whether to expect an escalation or an answer. Then the driver's door opened. You've made it this far because some part of you needs to see him get his dignity back. Don't let it end here for you. Subscribe now. Fred didn't get to walk away from this moment, and neither should you. Chief Richard Collins stepped out of the lead SUV, silver-haired, 4 stars pinned to each shoulder, and for a half-second his eyes swept the scene the way a man's eyes sweep a room he's walked into 1,000 times before, cataloging without effort. Tow truck, patrol car, crowd of phones, an officer standing beside a man bent over the hood of a black SUV. Then his gaze landed on the man's face, and everything about Collins changed at once. His shoulders dropped a half-inch. His jaw went slack before he caught it. He was already moving before he'd finished processing what he was looking at, closing the distance across the parking lot in long, urgent strides, and he didn't glance at Mercer once. Didn't acknowledge the tow truck driver frozen mid-motion at his controls. Didn't so much as register the dozens of phones swinging to track him. Fred? The name came out low, disbelieving. The way a person says a name they never expected to say in this particular place, under these particular circumstances. Mercer straightened fully now, some instinct telling him this was the moment to explain himself, to assert whatever remained of the version of events he'd built over the last 20 minutes. Chief, we got a call about a stolen vehicle matching. Take those cuffs off him. Collins didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The words landed with more force at a normal volume than Mercer's shouting had managed all afternoon. Now. Sir, if you'll let me explain the situation. I said now, officer. Mercer's hands moved to the cuffs, fumbling slightly, the practiced motion of putting them on utterly failing him now that he had to reverse it under a superior stare. The moment stretched, awkward and small, Fred's wrists finally coming free, and Fred straightened slowly, rolling one shoulder, working feeling back into fingers that had gone faintly numb. Collins reached out and gripped Fred's shoulder, the same shoulder Mercer had shoved against the hood 20 minutes earlier, and his hand was, unmistakably, trembling. Sir, he said it again, softer, and something in his voice cracked around the edge of the word. I'm sorry we kept you waiting. The parking lot had gone entirely silent. The kind of silence that made the tow truck's idling engine sound suddenly enormous, made the shuffle of 100 feet readjusting their footing audible in a way it hadn't been a moment before. Chief, Mercer said, and for the first time that afternoon, uncertainty crept into his voice. You know this man? And Collins turned toward him at last, and whatever warmth had been in his face when he looked at Fred was gone entirely now, replaced with something flat and cold that made Mercer take an involuntary half-step back. 8 years ago, on Route 9, a tanker jackknifed and a patrol vehicle got shoved into the guardrail with 2 officers trapped inside. Collins's voice didn't rise, but it carried across the whole lot, every word landing distinct and clear. One of those officers was me. This man pulled over on his own, pried that door open with his bare hands and a roadside kit while fuel was catching along the shoulder, and got both of us out before the fire reached the vehicle. A murmur moved through the crowd, phones still recording, capturing every syllable now with a different kind of attention than before. He's spent the years since rebuilding and maintaining this county's entire emergency response fleet, Collins continued. He's trained more officers on rescue systems than I can count off the top of my head. Officers who are alive today because of what Fred Bryan taught them about getting people out of vehicles that shouldn't have let them live. He's never asked for a plaque, never asked for a headline, never once used any of that to get out of a speeding ticket, let alone something like this. Mercer's face had gone pale, the color draining out steadily as Collins spoke, each sentence landing like another piece of ground giving way beneath him. I didn't know, Mercer said, and it came out smaller than anything he'd said all afternoon. You didn't ask, Collins said. You didn't run the plate. You didn't check the registration sitting in the glove box, which I understand he offered to show you multiple times. You decided who this man was the second you saw him, and everything after that was just you looking for reasons to be right. The old man in the ship's cap, still standing near the hardware store entrance, let out a breath that sounded almost like a laugh, though there was no humor in it, just the particular release of someone who'd tried to say something true and finally watched it be confirmed by someone with the rank to make it matter. Fred stood quietly through all of it, rubbing one wrist where the cuff had bitten in, watching Mercer absorb each sentence like a man taking hits he couldn't block. He felt no satisfaction in it. If anything, watching Mercer's certainty collapse in real time made something in his chest ache in a way he hadn't expected. "Chief," Fred said, finally, his first words since the cuffs had come off. "My daughter's waiting at her school. Today's her birthday." Collins's expression softened instantly, the weight of everything else falling away from his face, in favor of something closer to the man who'd once sat across from Fred, over untouched coffee. "Go," Collins said. "Take my car if yours needs processing off the tow truck's hook. I'll have someone follow with the paperwork." Fred managed the first small smile he'd allowed himself all afternoon. "I've got mine," he said, nodding toward the SUV, still balanced awkwardly on the flatbed's edge. "Just need it back on the ground." Behind them, Mercer stood motionless, radio still clipped uselessly to his shoulder, watching the crowd's attention shift entirely away from him and onto a story he'd never wanted to be part of, one he now understood he'd have to answer for. The SUV came off the flatbed 20 minutes later, tires meeting pavement with a soft double thud, and by then Fred was already gone, waved through the gathering by Collins himself, headed for the school where Ava was still waiting at the edge of the pickup line, checking her phone for a message that hadn't come. What remained behind in the Riverside Commons parking lot was an investigation that started forming itself before the tow truck had even finished pulling away. Collins didn't leave the scene to his officers. He stayed, arms crossed, watching his own department's internal affairs unit arrive within the hour, watching Mercer surrender his body camera without being asked twice, watching the crowd slowly disperse now that the story they'd been filming had resolved itself into something they didn't fully understand yet, but sensed was bigger than they'd realized. "I want everything," Collins told the IA lieutenant who'd taken point, a compact woman named Patricia Voss with a reputation for not caring whose name showed up in her reports. "Body cam, dash cam, the original dispatch call, and pull the plaza's security footage. All of it, today." "Yes, sir." It didn't take long. The plaza's camera system covered most of the lot, including, as it turned out, a clear angle on a car parked 3 rows from where Fred had pulled in, engine off, a man sitting inside it for several minutes before making a call. The footage told its own story without much need for interpretation. Gordon Hale, visible clearly through his windshield, watching the black SUV pull in. Gordon Hale reaching for his phone. Gordon Hale, talking for nearly 90 seconds, gesturing occasionally, before setting the phone down and continuing to watch Fred from across the lot, with an expression that even through grainy security footage read as something closer to satisfaction than concern. The dispatch recording, pulled and time-stamped within the hour, matched the footage precisely. 911, what's your emergency? Yeah, I want to report a stolen vehicle. I'm at Riverside Commons, and there's a man getting into a black SUV that I'm positive doesn't belong to him. I saw it at auction. I know who actually owns cars like that, and it isn't him. Voss played it twice, then looked up at Collins. He didn't say he thought it might be stolen, she said. He said he was positive, based on an auction he lost, 6 months ago, over a car he wanted and didn't get. Collins didn't need her to spell out what that meant. He'd already understood it standing in the parking lot, watching Mercer's face go through its slow collapse. But hearing the caller's own certainty laid out flat against the timeline of an old grudge made something in his stomach turn over anyway. Mercer's body camera footage, when it played back in full, was worse than anyone in the room expected, not because of anything dramatic in the footage itself, but because of everything that was missing from it. No moment where Mercer ran the plate, no moment where he opened the glove box Fred had directed him to at least 4 separate times. No moment where he paused, even briefly, to consider that the calm, specific way Fred kept describing his ownership documents might be worth checking before cuffs went on. He offered the registration 11 times, Voss said, having gone through the footage with a legal pad beside her, tally marks accumulating in a neat column. I stopped counting requests to run the plate somewhere around 6. Collins watched the footage in silence, jaw tight, remembering his own trembling hands reaching for Fred's shoulder less than 2 hours earlier. "Bring Mercer in," he said finally, "and find Gordon Hale." Hale was located without much difficulty. He hadn't gone far. In fact, he was still inside the plaza, having stopped for a coffee at the shop near the far entrance, as though the morning's events were already behind him, already a small, satisfying footnote in a day otherwise ordinary. 2 officers approached him near the register, and the moment he saw their faces, something in his own expression flickered, the first crack in the certainty that had carried him through the 911 call and everything after it. "Mr. Hale, we need you to come with us." "For what? I made a report. I did the right thing." "We have your call on record, sir, along with security footage showing your vehicle in the lot at the time of the report. We're going to need you to answer some questions." Gordon's coffee sat forgotten on the counter as they walked him out, his protests growing louder and less coherent with every step. Something about civic duty, about doing what any responsible citizen would do, about how was he supposed to know the man actually owned the car. Nobody in the plaza that afternoon believed him. Word of what had happened in the parking lot had already moved through the building faster than any official statement could, the way stories like that always do, and the same people who'd hesitated to help Fred an hour earlier now watched Gordon Hale's exit with an entirely different kind of certainty on their faces. Back at the station, Mercer sat across from Voss in a small interview room, his badge and radio set on the table between them, untouched, as though neither of them wanted to be the one to move them first. "Walk me through it," Voss said. "Start with why you never ran the plate." Mercer stared at the table for a long moment before answering. "I thought I already knew," he said finally. "I heard the call, I saw the car, I saw him get out of it, and I thought I already knew everything I needed to know." 30 seconds, Voss said, not unkindly, just stating the fact the way it needed to be stated. That's how long it would have taken to confirm ownership. 30 seconds, and none of this happens. Mercer didn't have an answer for that. There wasn't one that would have made any of it easier to hear, and he seemed, for the first time all day, to understand exactly how much 30 seconds could have been worth. Mercer surrendered his badge on a Thursday, 3 days after the interview room, in a small administrative office that smelled like burnt coffee and carried none of the weight the moment deserved. He set it on the desk first, then his service weapon, then finally the keys to the patrol vehicle he'd driven for the last 2 years. And Collins, standing near the window with his arms crossed, watched the whole process without saying much. There wasn't much left to say that hadn't already been said in the days since Riverside Commons. "This isn't personal," Collins said, once the paperwork was mostly finished. "I need you to understand that. I'm not doing this because of who you cuffed. I'm doing this because of what you didn't do before you cuffed him." "I know," Mercer said, and for once he sounded like he meant it. "I keep going back over it. 30 seconds. 30 seconds, Collins agreed. "That's the whole case, really. Everything else is just details around that one fact." Mercer nodded, gathered nothing because there was nothing left on the desk that belonged to him anymore, and left the way most people leave rooms like that, slower than they arrived, uncertain what to do with the space where a badge used to sit against their chest. Collins remained a moment longer, staring out the window at the lot below, and reminded himself, not for the first time that week, that none of this had been about proving Fred Bryan's worth. It had never needed proving to Collins. It was about a system that let a man's worth go unchecked in the first place, that allowed an officer to skip a 30-second verification because a story had already written itself in his head before he'd stepped out of his car. Across town, Fred Bryan was having a considerably harder conversation, one that had nothing to do with badges or investigations. Ava sat across from him at the kitchen table, birthday cake barely touched between them, her fork resting against the plate while she processed what her father had finally decided to tell her, gently, in pieces, about what had actually happened that afternoon before Collins arrived. "They put handcuffs on you," she said, not quite a question, working through the shape of it. "For no reason." "For a reason that turned out to be wrong," Fred said. "Somebody made a call based on something that wasn't true, and the officer who responded believed it before he checked." "That's not fair." "No," Fred agreed. "It's not." Ava was quiet for a while, turning her fork over once, twice, her 10-year-old mind working through a version of unfairness that felt larger and more personal than anything she'd encountered before. "Are you mad at him, the officer?" Fred considered the question longer than she probably expected him to. "I was, for a minute," he said finally. "Standing there, I was. But being mad at him doesn't fix what happened, and it doesn't stop the next person it happens to. What actually helps is making sure it's harder for it to happen again. How do you do that? You ask for the right things instead of the easy things." Fred reached across and squeezed her hand once. Getting him fired feels satisfying, maybe, but it doesn't teach the next officer anything. Making sure everyone checks the facts before they act, that teaches something. That protects somebody else's dad, somewhere, on some other afternoon. Ava considered this with the particular seriousness that 10-year-olds sometimes bring to ideas too big for the room they're sitting in, and Fred watched her work through it, proud in a way he didn't quite have words for, that his daughter's instinct toward fairness ran that deep already, unprompted, entirely her own. "I still think he should be sorry," she said finally. "He is," Fred said. "I saw it on his face. That doesn't undo it, but it's something." The conversation stayed with Fred longer than he expected it to, threading through the following days as Collins reached out to check in, first by phone, then in person, stopping by the shop on a Tuesday afternoon under the pretense of picking up paperwork neither of them actually needed to exchange in person. "I owe you a real conversation," Collins said, leaning against the doorframe of Bay 2 while Fred worked a stubborn bolt free from an old suspension mount. "Not a chief-to-citizen conversation, just us." "You don't owe me anything," Fred said, not looking up from the bolt. "You did what needed doing that day. That's enough." "It's not, actually." Collins crossed his arms, watching Fred work with the patience of a man who'd learned, over years of visits to this shop, that Fred talked more easily with his hands busy than with his hands idle. "I keep thinking about how close that was to going differently. If we'd been 10 minutes later, if nobody in that crowd had a phone out, if Mercer had gotten a little more aggressive before we arrived, instead of just careless. But none of that happened," Fred said. "This time." Fred finally looked up at that, bolt loose in his hand, and understood exactly what Collins meant by it, the quiet fear sitting underneath the words. This time it had been Fred, a man Collins personally knew, a man whose name carried weight the moment it reached the right ears. Next time there was no guarantee any of that would be true. "What would you change?" Collins asked. "If I asked you right now, genuinely, what needs to be different so this doesn't happen to somebody who doesn't have a chief who recognizes them?" Fred set the bolt down slowly, wiped his hands on the rag hanging from his back pocket, and took his time answering, because the question deserved more than a quick response. "Give me a few days," he said finally. "I want to think about it properly before I answer that." Collins gave Fred exactly as much time as he'd asked for. 4 days passed without either of them raising the subject again, Fred working through a backlog of restoration jobs that had piled up during the week. The story had spread through the county. Collins handling the tail end of Mercer's disciplinary paperwork and the separate matter of Gordon Hale's charges, which had moved from the Plaza coffee shop to formal filing with a speed that suggested the district attorney's office had no interest in dragging its feet on this particular case. On the 5th day, Collins came back to the shop, this time without the pretense of paperwork, and found Fred in the office rather than the bay, a legal pad on the desk in front of him covered in handwriting that filled nearly 2 full pages. "You actually wrote it out," Collins said, settling into the chair across from him. "You asked a real question, figured it deserved a real answer, not something I just said off the top of my head standing in a garage." Collins gestured for him to go ahead, and Fred glanced down at the pad, though he didn't really need it. He'd been carrying the substance of it in his chest for days, turning it over the way he turned over a stubborn part, before deciding exactly how to approach it. "First thing," Fred said, "mandatory plate and registration verification before anyone's put in cuffs on a property dispute, unless there's an active safety threat. Not after, before. If the technology exists to check it in under a minute, there's no excuse for skipping that step, because somebody's already decided what they're looking at." Collins nodded slowly, already reaching for a small notebook of his own. "Second, de-escalation training that actually gets renewed, not just completed once at the academy and forgotten. I've watched officers train on rescue systems for years, and the ones who stay sharp are the ones who keep practicing, not the ones who checked a box a decade ago. This should work the same way." "Agreed." "Third," Fred paused here, and something in his voice shifted, quieter, more deliberate. "I don't want any of this attached to my name specifically. I don't want a policy called the Bryan Protocol, or anything that turns this into a story about me getting special treatment because of who I turned out to be. That's the whole problem, Richard. The system worked out fine for me because you happen to recognize my face. It shouldn't need that. It should work the same for somebody whose name nobody in a chief's office would ever know." Collins sat with that for a moment, pen still against the paper, and Fred could see him working through the discomfort of it, the natural instinct of an institution to attach a human face to a policy change, to make the story clean and easy to communicate. "That's going to make it a harder sell," Collins admitted. "People respond to stories. A policy named after what happened to you would get faster buy-in from the county board." "I don't care if it's a harder sell," Fred said. "Today it happened to me. I've got a chief who owed me his life, dozens of witnesses with their phones out, and a story dramatic enough that nobody could look away from it. Tomorrow it happens to somebody whose phone never rings after. Somebody who doesn't have any of that. If the fix only works because I happen to be the one standing there, it isn't actually a fix. It's just luck wearing a badge number." The office went quiet for a moment, Collins looking down at his notebook, at the half-formed draft of a policy proposal that had, until 30 seconds ago, been shaping itself around the very story Fred was now asking him to strip out of it entirely. "You could ask for more," Collins said finally. "Nobody in this county would blink if you wanted Mercer's job permanently unavailable to him anywhere in the state. Nobody would blink if you wanted a formal county apology, a ceremony, something. You've got more leverage right now than you'll probably ever have again, and you're spending all of it on paperwork nobody's going to put your name on." Fred considered this, turning the pen over once between his fingers. "I don't want Mercer's whole life over one afternoon, even a bad one," he said. "I want him to understand what 30 seconds meant, and I think he already does. What I don't want is for the department to feel like it settled things just because it fired one guy and arrested one guy. That's easy. That doesn't cost anyone anything going forward. Changing the actual process, that costs something. That's harder to walk back later when everyone's forgotten my name. You really think they'll forget your name?" "I hope they do," Fred said, and he meant it. "I don't want to be famous for getting handcuffed in a parking lot. I want the next person this almost happens to never even know how close it came, because the plate got run before anybody reached for cuffs." Collins studied him for a long moment, something working behind his eyes that looked, to Fred, a great deal like the same expression he'd worn years ago on the shoulder of Route 9, soot on his face, staring at the man who'd just pried him out of a burning vehicle like he was trying to memorize him. "I'm going to bring this to the board next week," Collins said finally. "Verification requirements, renewed de-escalation training, and I'll leave your name out of the language entirely. But I want you to know something, and I want you to actually hear it instead of brushing it off, the way you brush off everything else people say about you." Fred waited. "What you're doing right now, sitting here asking for a policy instead of a apology, that's not nothing. That's the same thing you did on that highway. You didn't stop to think about what it would cost you to pry that door open with fuel catching along the shoulder. You just did the thing that needed doing. This is the same instinct. I've known you 8 years, and I don't think you've changed even a little." Fred didn't have a quick answer for that, and for a moment the office held the kind of silence that didn't need filling. Two men who'd each, in their own way, owed something significant to a stranger's decision to do the right thing without being asked. Later that evening, after Collins had gone and Fred had locked the shop for the night, he sat for a long while in the driver's seat of the black SUV before starting the engine, staring at the dashboard, thinking about the parking lot, the cuffs, the crowd of phones, the elderly veteran who'd tried twice and been dismissed twice. He thought, too, about Mercer's face in that last moment, the color draining out of it as Collins spoke, and found that whatever anger he'd carried that afternoon had mostly settled into something quieter now, something closer to a tired kind of clarity. Respect shouldn't begin the moment someone proves they're important, he thought, turning the key. It should begin the moment you meet another human being. He didn't say it out loud. He didn't need to. He just drove home, slow and steady through streets that had no idea what had almost happened 3 miles away, toward a daughter who was waiting up, wanting to hear how her father's day had actually gone. 6 months moved past the way most months do, once a story's loudest moment has already happened, quietly, without anyone announcing their arrival or their leaving. Officer Daniel Mercer's disciplinary process concluded in early spring, the county board voting to permanently bar him from returning to any law enforcement position within its jurisdiction, a decision that made the local paper for exactly one news cycle before the world moved on to whatever came next. Fred read the article once, standing at the counter of his shop with coffee going cold in his hand, and felt none of the satisfaction he might have expected 6 months earlier. Just a kind of settled acknowledgement that the thing had run its course the way it needed to. Gordon Hale's case took longer, dragged through pretrial motions by a lawyer who seemed to believe, right up until the final hearing, that a jury somewhere might see things his client's way. They didn't. Gordon was convicted of filing a knowingly false police report, a charge that came with a fine steep enough to sting, and a suspended sentence contingent on community service he complained about loudly to anyone who'd still listen. Fewer people were listening by then than had been 6 months before. The policy Fred had asked for passed the county board on the second reading. Mandatory verification procedures before any property-based detention, wherever practical, renewed de-escalation training on a recurring schedule rather than a one-time academy requirement. The language, exactly as Fred had requested, carried no reference to his name, no mention of a specific incident, nothing that would let anyone reading it years from now trace it back to a parking lot at Riverside Commons. Collins had fought for that anonymity harder than the county board expected, and won it. Though it cost him some political capital, he'd clearly rather have spent elsewhere. Fred's shop, meanwhile, had become busier than it had ever been. Not because of the story, though plenty of people who'd heard it found their way to Bryan Restorations eventually out of simple curiosity, but because word traveled the way word always traveled, in a trade built on trust. A man who did honest work got more honest work. That had always been true, long before any of this happened, and it remained true afterward, mostly unaffected by everything else. Ava's 11th birthday arrived on an ordinary Tuesday, nothing like the disruption of her 10th, and Fred made a point of taking the whole day off. No job scheduled, no phone calls returned. Just the two of them and a cake she'd insisted on baking herself this year. Chocolate with frosting applied in thick, uneven swirls that she was fiercely proud of, despite the mess it made of the kitchen counter. "You remember last year," she said, not quite a question, licking frosting off her thumb. "I remember," Fred said. "Do you still think about it?" Fred considered the question honestly before answering, the way he tried to answer all her questions now, especially the hard ones. "Sometimes," he said. "Not the part where I was scared, more the part where nobody helped, at first. That part sticks with me more than the handcuffs did, honestly. Except the old man. He tried." "He did," Fred agreed, and something in his chest warmed slightly at her, remembering that detail, at her holding on to the good alongside the bad instead of letting the bad swallow the whole memory. He tried twice. That matters. Not everybody who could have helped tried at all. Ava nodded, cutting into the cake with more focus than the task strictly required, and Fred watched her, struck again, the way he was struck often lately, by how much of her mother lived in the particular seriousness she brought to things she cared about. Chief Richard Collins visited the shop that same week, not in uniform, driving his own car rather than a county vehicle, carrying nothing more official than a bag of coffee from the place 2 doors down that Fred liked. "Not here on business," Collins said, setting the bag on the workbench. "Just here." "Appreciate that." Fred wiped his hands and accepted the coffee, and the two of them settled into the kind of easy quiet that had grown between them over the past months. The particular comfort of two men who'd each, at different points, owed the other something neither of them talked about much anymore, because it didn't need talking about. "New recruit class starts training next month," Collins said eventually. "I want you to come speak to them. Not about rescue systems this time, about the other thing." Fred raised an eyebrow. "The other thing?" "What happened to you? What it looked like from where you were standing. I've had officers read the incident report a dozen times over, but reading about it and hearing it from the man it happened to, that's different. I want them to understand what 30 seconds actually costs before they're the ones standing over somebody's hood deciding whether to spend it." Fred thought about it for a long moment, the same deliberate pause he'd given every serious question Collins had brought him over the past 6 months. "I'll do it," he said finally. "Not because I want the attention. You know that by now. But if it means one of them runs a plate before they reach for cuffs, that's 30 minutes of my time well spent." "That's what I figured you'd say." Collins stayed another hour, mostly talking about nothing in particular, the way old friends do when the friendship has moved past needing an occasion to justify the visit, and left with a promise to send over the details for the training session once the schedule firmed up. The following Monday, Fred did as he did most mornings, drove Ava to school in the same black SUV that had spent one terrible afternoon on the back of a tow truck's flatbed. People noticed the car sometimes now, a few recognizing it, a few recognizing him, nods exchanged through open windows at stoplights that carried more warmth than words would have managed. It no longer mattered to Fred whether they recognized him or not. He'd never wanted that kind of attention, and the parts of the past 6 months he was proudest of, the policy, the ongoing training, Ava's steady recovery from a day that could have scarred her far worse than it had, none of it depended on anyone in a passing car knowing his name. He pulled into the school's drop-off line, and Ava gathered her bag, pausing at the door the way she sometimes did lately, thoughtful in a way that still occasionally caught him off guard. "I'm glad it was you that day," she said. "I know that sounds weird, but I'm glad it happened to somebody who knew how to make it turn into something good instead of just something bad." Fred reached over and squeezed her hand once, the same gesture he'd offered across the kitchen table 6 months earlier, when she'd first asked him if he was angry. "Me too," he said. "Go on, you'll be late." She climbed out, disappeared into the flow of students heading toward the entrance, and Fred sat for a moment longer, watching her go, before pulling back out into traffic. Respect, he thought again, the same words that had settled into him the night he drove home from the shop months earlier, shouldn't begin the moment someone proves they're important. It should begin the moment you meet another human being. He drove on, unremarkable, one dark SUV among many on an ordinary morning, carrying a story most of the people around him would never know, and needing, at last, nothing from any of them except the road ahead. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. If this story meant something to you, I'd really love for you to subscribe. Before you go, leave a comment and rate this story from 1 to 10. I read your comments, and I always enjoy seeing your thoughts and perspectives. If you're ready for another unforgettable story, just tap the next video on your screen. I'll see you there.